Hello, my name is Sarah, and today I'll be sewing the Inman top and dress by Cashmerette. The Inman top and dress is for Cashmerette Club. To learn more about Cashmerette Club membership program, check the link in the description. Romantic details meet curve-friendly fit in the Inman top and dress, featuring rouleau loops, button finish down the center front, dart shaping, and 2 sleeve options. One, a bishop sleeve with an elasticized wrist at the bottom, or a short sleeve, both with gathers at the shoulders. The Inman top and dress both have a facing to clean finish the front and neckline, and a button placket facing that sits behind the rouleau button loop opening. I'll be sewing the dress version today with the bishop sleeve, and I'll also show you the short sleeve option as well. Are you ready to get sewing? Let's do it. Today I'll be sewing my Inman dress with a rayon fabric that's printed. This is the right side and this is the wrong side. And you'll see that I've clipped my notches in the shape that they are on the pattern pieces. I don't recommend doing this. This is only so they're visible on camera. There's a tip in the instructions to just clip into your fabric about 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters, and that will be sufficient to mark your notches. I'll be sewing the Inman using a straight stitch at a 2.5 length. And I'm going to be finishing my seams with an overlock. You'll see right here, right next to my seam. For our notions today, we have some 1/2 inch or 1.2 centimeter wide elastic. Mine is a little bit narrower because this is what I have on hand. And I have 20 buttons for the center front dress, and I'm using a regular weight thread. All of our seam allowances are 1/2 inch or 1.2 centimeters unless I tell you otherwise, and I'll walk you through all the steps as we go. I'm going to be using a fusible woven interfacing, and I'm going to show you the clean finish method for your interfacing, but I'll also walk you through the steps on doing it another way. Let's get sewing. Our first step is interfacing. We're going to be interfacing the button placket facing, and you can interface this piece in the traditional way if you're using a fusible. We're going to place our interfacing on one side of our button placket. We're also interfacing our front facing and our back neck facing, and I'll be sewing this with a clean finish style. If you want to use a traditional method, you're going to fuse your interfacing to the wrong side of your facing pieces, and then you're going to finish your edge right here with the seam finish that you plan on using throughout assembling your Inman dress. To clean finish our facings, we're going to place our facing pieces right sides together to our interfacing pieces. And what I mean by this is we're going to place the non-fusible side of our interfacing. If you're not using a fusible interfacing, that won't matter. If your interfacing is fusible, the fusible side is the wrong side. So we're going to place our fabric right sides to our facing here. And we're going to pin on this outer edge. And now we're going to sew this outer curved edge using a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance. Now we're going to trim the seam allowance down to 1/2 its width. Now we're going to flip these wrong sides together and we're going to press them. And I'm going to finger press this seam here to make sure that we can kind of get a nice smooth edge here, since we can't iron it first. And now we're going to place this wrong sides together. I'm going to try and get a nice clean edge here and press it first. So I'm kind of rolling the top here so that it's right on the edge. Get it in place. And we're going to go all the way down the facing. You don't want to see any of that interfacing, so make sure that it's slightly to the underside. I tend to be a puller, like I will definitely over pull things and stretch them out a little bit. So I found that you need to be kind of gentle with this, because the more that you try and force it, then you might distort the fabric in other areas and then it won't line up. So it's an exercise in being gentle for me. And you can tell I'm not completely fusing the whole piece yet. I want to get it in position before I really fuse the interfacing to the fabric. I don't mind that little bit of extra there. I'll just trim it off rather than over pulling it. Okay, now I'm going to fuse this like I normally would. And we have our clean finished facing here along the outer edge. You're gonna repeat for your other front facing, and now let's sew our back neck facing. We're gonna do the same thing with our back neck facing. We're going to sew it with our 1/4 inch seam along the outer perimeter. If you start getting a little buckling around some of those curves, just lift your presser foot up and release the tension on the fabric. It'll help. And now we're going to trim that seam allowance to half its width, and then we'll turn it wrong sides together and press just like we did on the front facing. And now our facings are ready to assemble. Our facings are ready to go. They're nice and clean finished. We got our fronts and our back, and I've already added a label. This is a heat transfer, so you'll see that along the way as well. Starting from the center front, we're going to stay stitch our neckline going toward the shoulders. We're going to stay just inside our full seam allowance. All right, we have our fronts and our back stay stitched. We're going to start sewing all of our darts. For the side bust dart, I'm going to start at the side seam and go toward the vanishing point. I don't backstitch, I hand tie the end, but I backstitch at the beginning. For the fisheye dart, we'll start at the waist of the dart and sew toward the vanishing point. Flip it over, and then we'll sew down to the other vanishing point. And now we'll tie our darts. You can press your side bust dart up or down. Whichever way you do it, make sure you trim the dart intake to match your side seam silhouette. I've pressed my dart going up and my fisheye dart going towards the center, and I'm going to trim my dart shaping here to match my side seam. We're going to repeat to sew all of our darts on our fronts and our backs. Line up your front shoulders to your back shoulders, and we're going to sew them together with a 1/2 inch or 1.2 centimeter seam. Finish your seam allowances and press them toward the back. For the button loops, you're going to need 1 of these for the top, but 2 of these for the dress. We're going to fold it right sides together, and we'll sew using a 1/4 inch seam or 6 millimeters. It's a little fiddly, but just make sure you don't pull on it because that will make it even narrower. You just want to meet the edges and get it sewn as quick as possible. There we go, and now we're going to trim the seam allowance to 1/2 the width. I'm going to use a loop turner to turn this right side out, and I'll show you another way to turn this right side out on the other one. But you'll need to do a little prep with the sewing first. The trick with the loop turner is to don't get too greedy. Just turn a little bit as you go. And once you can get, and try also not to relax your tension on it because you don't want it to come unhooked from the loop turner. And once the loop turner exits, undo it, and now you can be a little bit faster. I'm gonna pick out this little end here that gets caught in there. So now another way to sew this is to add a thread down the entire length and secure it. And so I'm gonna pull a long thread. Okay, so now I have my long thread here. You can barely see it, and it's still attached to the needle. And so I'm going to lay the thread in here and place my 2 right sides together And we'll start sewing. We don't want to sew on that thread, so just be really careful you keep it out of the way. Another way to go about this is, if you've already sewn your tube, you can thread a needle with a really long piece of thread, and then put a few securing stitches to the end of the tube with one layer of it with your needle and your thread, and then put your needle all the way through, and then you'll kind of have the same thing I'm going for here. So this finger's just sort of keeping it to the left, and if you keep a little tension on the thread, it will keep it to the left as well and keep it out of the way of the needle. Now I made it really long, so I'm going to trim some of it off. And again, we're going to trim down our seam allowance, but leave that little thread hanging out the end. I think I could have done a little better job with my 1/4 inch seam here. This method is going to be great for fabrics that are just a little on the heavy end. But the rouleau loops are pretty hard to do when your fabric is a little too heavy. All right, so now I'm going to pull on this thread here, and it's going to pull in the end, just like that. And as soon as you get it kind of started, so when I'm holding this, I really want all of the perimeter of the opening here to start sticking into the tube. And I don't want to squeeze against this with my fingers too tight. I don't want to hold it too tight. I want to gently do it. And then now, once I've got it in there, it'll be a lot easier. I'm going to choke up a little bit here. And here I am, I'm just pulling to turn it. Just like that. My rouleau is a little wide. All right, here we have our rouleau loops. We're going to cut our loops now from our prepared loop strap here, and we're going to cut them into 2-inch lengths. Now that's for if you're using a 3/8 inch button or 1 centimeter size button. We'll cut 14 for the dress and 7 for the top in 2-inch or 5 centimeter lengths if you're using 3/8 inch buttons or 1 centimeter buttons. All right, we have our loops. All right, so we're going to place our loop with the cut ends together. I'm going to try and keep the seam end lined up like this. They're touching. And we're going to center it over the notch. I'm going to sew these on as I go. And we're going to attach them with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam. All right, got all our button loops on there. It's starting to look like the Inman dress or top. Fold your button placket facing right sides together along the short ends. We're going to sew the end together using our full seam allowance. We're going to do this at the top and at the bottom. You can trim the seam allowances a little bit. And now we'll turn these right side out. And we're going to press this in half to make our button placket. Place your placket facing with the interfaced side layer right sides to your left front. And we're going to line up our sewn top finished edge there to the drill mark right here at the neckline. And we're going to stitch this in place along the center front. And we're going to sew it with a 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance just inside the full seam allowance. There we go, we have our button placket on there. Time to assemble and attach our neckline facing. First, we're going to sew our shoulder seams together. So place your front facing to your back neck facings. And so with a 1/2 inch or 1.2 centimeter seam allowance, you repeat for the other side. Now we'll place our facing onto our dress or our top. We're going to line it up along the neckline. You're going to match your shoulder seams, your neckline, and the bottom hem. We're going to sew from the hem of the top of the dress up the front and around the back neck and then down to the hem again. We're going to use our 1/2 inch or 1.2 centimeter seam allowance so that we can enclose the stitching that we've already added to the center front to hold the placket facing and the button loops. We want to pivot our needle just on the other side of our placket facing here. So make sure that when you pivot to go up your neckline, your needle is off of this placket facing. I usually like to take my awl and make a little groove there, pushing it up against so I know exactly where the end of that is. And then we pivot. And this is something I'm always going to double check while I'm here. There we go, that looks good. When I'm sewing curves like this, I try to create the curve. So you can kind of see I'm forming it. And since I'm making the dress, there's a lot of fabric and the fabric is pulling on what I'm working on. So a lot of times I'll bundle it up and just kind of, I fold it up and I pin it so that it's a little easier to deal with. I didn't do that to the front, but I did do that on the back. And so now I'm kind of bending this neckline around to sort of put it into that curved shape. And then I hold it like that. In other words, instead of going like this, pulling it over, because then that will make it a little harder for it to line up. Maybe now's a good time to check your button size to your button loop size. So maybe sew a couple and then check your button is going to go through the hole and also stay securely in there. You don't want it too large or too small. Now I'm just going to make sure none of my stitching to secure these loops is showing on this seam here. Oh, they look so cute. And same with the placket over here. I'm going to make sure that none of my stay stitching is showing. All right, pretty good to go. Press your facing and your seam allowances away from your garment, but keep your button loops and your button placket facing pressed toward the garment. So it'll look like this. And now we're going to understitch all the way around. We're going to start our understitching 1.5 inches or 3.8 centimeters away from the hem edge here. So we're understitching the seam allowances toward the facing. You're going to have a lot of garment to manage, so try and keep it from pulling on your needle if you're making the dress. So when you get up here at the neckline juncture, we're going to turn the corner, and if you're having trouble doing that, I would just stop right before it and then pick back up again along the neckline. But we're going to do our best to kind of keep a continuous stitch here. So I'm really pulling the seam apart pretty firmly. We don't want to catch anything else under there. And again, just focus on the little bit in front of your needle, especially along these curves. Try and keep my little button loops from flipping from flipping under my needle. When we get back to the hem, again, we're going to stop 1.5 inches or 3.8 centimeters away from the edge. Just like that. Now we're going to fold our facing right sides together to our front. And you want to make sure you're folding it right along that seam there. And we're going to sew across the bottom for our hem. So I'm going to sew at a 1 inch or 2.5 centimeter distance. Just like this. And I usually trim a little bit of the facing away, something like this. And then I trim this corner like this. So I leave a little bit of the dress or top into the facing. You don't want to trim all of that off, just leave a little bit there. And when we turn it to the right side, you'll see your hem is going to go under the facing here, just like that. So it kind of gives you a nice clean finish at the bottom there. So now we're going to repeat with our other facing. Just like this. All right, so I'm going to trim this down here. And then again, I pick up just the facing and I trim the rest like this. Like that. Trim a nice corner. Get rid of my understitch thread there, just like that. Now we're going to give this a really good press all along the center fronts and the neckline, and then we're going to secure our facing in the shoulder seams once we have this pressed nicely. All right, it's looking pretty nice. So make sure that your placket lines up from neck to hem. You want to make sure that you don't have any length issues, and I would make the adjustment at the hem, maybe shorten. If you need to shorten one side, then you're going to sew across the bottom a little bit higher up, and then you'll need to trim your hem to align with the rest of the hem to kind of even it out a little bit. But you'll want those to match. We've pressed our facing toward the garment, and we've got a nice smooth edge along our neckline here. And I've pinned my facing secure at the shoulders here. Now, sometimes you're going to find that your shoulder seam doesn't line up to the facing shoulder seam, and that is okay. Priority is the facing to lay nice and flush and relaxed inside the garment and flush with the neckline here. So if I were to pull the shoulder seam to make sure that it lined up, you can see I get a little bit of buckling here, and we don't want that. So your priority is to allow the facing to be relaxed in there and nice and flush, and then pin it. And if the shoulder seam lines up, nice, but sometimes it just doesn't. All right, we're going to stitch in the ditch along our shoulder seams to secure the facing. That way it won't flip out while we're wearing it. And what we're going to do is we're going to pull apart our seam here as we're sewing, and we're going to stitch right in that ditch. Now I'm using contrast thread today, so it's a little easier for you to see on camera. So you might see mine. It really won't be a big deal, so don't worry too much about it. Definitely back tack it and secure it really well, because I do find these come out over time no matter how well I sew them. It's just one of those weird quirks. So I'm going to start at the outer edge of my facing here, and I always do this from the right side of the garment. And now once I have my needle centered over that seam there, I'm going to pull this apart and slip the needle in between and sew it. And I'll show you my other side as well closer up. And I don't do the whole thing, I just do a little bit here. All right, let me show you a little closer. All right, so here's my shoulder seam right here. Here's my end of my facing here. And I'm gonna start probably about 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters away from the neckline. This is a pretty wide facing. And again, I'm pulling this apart. I'm gonna center my needle right over the seam. And if you wanna start it by dropping your hand wheel, you can turn your hand wheel toward you to get the needle in there to sort of start it off, and then pull this apart pretty firmly. Always back tack. I'm gonna remove my pin. Here we go. It actually looks better on the inside. Sometimes that happens. And once this is washed and worn a few times, it sort of just blends in and it'll nestle in the seam really nicely. And if your thread matches, it'll look a lot better. We're on the home stretch of our Inman top and dress, and now we're going to attach our sleeves. I'm going to show you both the long and the short sleeves. We're going to first add our gathering stitches along the cap, and we're going to put them between these two notches right here. We have our back and front notches that are lower down. We're going to put our gathering stitches right here. We're going to lengthen our stitch length to about 4 or 5 millimeters. And we're going to sew 2 rows inside the seam allowance. For the long sleeve only, we're going to press under 1/2 inch or 1.2 centimeters along the long unnotched edge of our sleeve hem facing. That should be this top edge here. So if we were to lay this on the facing just like this, it's going to be this top edge. If you have trouble pressing under this 1/2 inch along the curve, what you can do is add a stitch just inside the 1/2 inch seam. And now when we take this to our iron, we have this little bridge stitch here to press up against as we iron it up, just like this. It kind of gives you like a backstop or an edge to press against. And if you find the curve is really hard, you can even pull on one of your threads to tighten it up just a tiny bit. This is great for curved pockets as well, just like this. And it makes it even easier to press that edge under. So press your long unnotched edge. Here we go, we have our facing pressed. And now we'll trim this seam allowance by 1/2. We're going to sew it right sides together to the bottom of our sleeve. We'll sew at our full seam allowance. And again, try and keep it relaxed. Don't pull it or stretch it along these curves, and keep it in the curve shape. We'll trim our seam allowance in 1/2. We're going to press the facing away from the sleeve, but the seam allowance toward the facing, and we're going to understitch it. So we're going to keep the seam allowance pressed that way, and then press the facing the same direction. All right, so we have our seam allowance pressed towards our facing. And now we're going to understitch the seam allowance to this facing. Now we're going to place our sleeve right sides together to the armhole, and we're going to line it up along the armhole, matching the notches. And then we're going to gather it to fit. So I like to pin it at all the landmarks, which are usually the notches. And then we have the center of the sleeve going to the shoulder seam here. And remember, the shoulder seam presses toward the back. So here we go. We have our slack there that we're going to gather up. And we'll continue around to the armhole. Remember, you want it to line up right here at that full seam allowance right there. So it's okay that that little point is hanging up. You're not hanging off. You don't want to line these points up. You want to line the seam lines up. And now we can gather between these notches here. Evenly distribute them. You want to pull the threads from the same side at each end, meaning if you started pulling your threads from the right side of the fabric, you'll want to pull on the right side at the other end of your stitches. In other words, always pull bobbin or always pull the top. And now we're just going to kind of finesse these into place so that they look evenly distributed, just like that. All right, and here we have our whole sleeve pinned to our armhole. Now we'll sew the sleeve onto the bodice or the dress at our full seam allowance. Now again, just make sure gathers are even. And you're going to stitch right next to your gathering stitches. Make sure that none of them are to the left of your needle. Otherwise they'll show. You can see sometimes I go like this with the gathers. I make them nice and straight. It makes them hang a little nicer. Okay, there we go. And now we want to finish this seam allowance. Once your sleeves are both attached and your seam allowances are finished, we're now going to sew the side seam and the underarm of the sleeve. For the long sleeve here, we're going to open up this facing and this pressed edge. We're going to line up the seams of the facing, the underarm to the armhole seam here at the underarm, and the side seam. We're going to start our sewing at the hem. We're pressing our seam allowances of the sleeve toward the sleeve. Now we're going to finish this seam allowance, and then you'll repeat for your other underarm and side seam. For our short sleeve, we're going to line up our underarm seams here at the armhole. And we'll sew right through to the hem of the sleeve. And we'll finish that seam allowance as well. To hem your short sleeve, you're going to press under the hem edge 1/2 inch or 1.2 centimeters twice. So we'll press it once and then again. And then we'll edge stitch the hem. I always find it easier to sew these circles like this from the inside, so the garment's right side out, but we're sewing from the inside. This way none of my garment will get caught underneath where I'm sewing. And you'll repeat for your other short sleeve. For our long sleeve, we're going to press our facing to the inside, and you can see here I repress this little fold under edge so that it's a nice smooth continuous line. We're going to stitch our facing down to the inside, and to make sure when you press this that you can't see any of your understitched edge creeping onto the right side, just like this. We're going to leave a 2 inch or 3.8 centimeter gap so that we can insert our elastic. I'm going to sort of stabilize it with my fingers so that I don't accidentally pull along this edge and torque it. We want the facing to lay nice, flat, and flush, the curves to be nice and smooth. Okay, don't forget to leave your gap. Using the elastic table in the instructions, you're going to stretch your elastic a few times, cut it to the length for your size, and using a safety pin or something similar, we're going to feed our elastic through the casing that we made. I'm going to pin my elastic so I don't lose it. All right, now that we're back at the beginning, let's make sure we didn't twist our elastic, and we're going to secure our ends together. We're going to overlap them 1/2 inch or 1.2 centimeters, just like this flat. And definitely make sure you secure this a few times. I'm just going to sew over it a few times. I always sew it like this, a little flat. The X is just my loose threads there. If you want to trim them, you can. And now we can let it suck into the casing, just like this. And now we're going to edge stitch the gap that we created. There we go. We're on our last step sewing our Inman dress and top. We just need to do the hem. We're going to press our hem 1/2 inch up or 1.2 centimeters and again with another 1/2 inch so that we've pressed our 1 inch hem allowance. And under the facing here, it's just going to continue on into the facing just like that. And we're going to start our sewing right here at the edge of the facing and go all the way around to the front. I usually like to catch the facing by like 1 stitch just to close it there. All right, we're back at the beginning here, making sure everything's nice and relaxed. And there we go. Looks very nice. Trim our threads, give it a nice press, and you're good to go. Your final step is to attach your buttons. Pin your placket closed so that the center fronts meet. You don't want a gap there. And then mark the button positions using your loops as your guide. Thanks for sewing your Inman dress or top with me today. My name's Sarah, and I'll see you in the next one. Happy sewing!